quick show of hands. Who here are founders or CEOs in the room? All right, good. So we got a pretty good mix. So I'm Jason Purcell. I'm one of the co-founders. I started Salsify with two other people, Rob and Jeremy, who hopefully you'll have a chance to meet over the course of the day. And I'll let Brett Hurt introduce himself because he's done far more than we have at Salsify. But he founded one of the companies that I've admired since before I started Salsify, called Bizarre Voice. So I'll let you give a quick intro and then we'll dive in.
Sure, yeah. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I always love coming to Boston. You guys have very, very good weather right now. So I've been an entrepreneur for a long time. I started my first business when I was 24 years old. I'm 45 now. I was really lucky growing up, although it didn't feel like it at the time. I started programming when I was 7 years old. My mom taught me how to program. Well, I should say she actually learned how to program with me, and I did that for over 40 hours a week from age 7 to 21. That turned into a very, very good skill set to have for the way the world evolved. I say not lucky in the sense that I got picked on a ton as a kid for being a nerd and just being different. But I guess I'd be cool now. I started my first business at 24, as I mentioned. I've started 6 businesses. We're going to talk a lot about Bizarre Voice, and that was the most epic journey I've been on. We went from 0 to over 100 million in sales in 6 years. We only raised 23 million prior to our IPO, and we had 12.7 million in the bank when we went public. It was rated the #1 company to work for in Austin when it was small, then medium, then large. And it just felt electric. We hit the market timing perfectly. Current journey I'm on is my first B corporation. It's called Data.World. As GitHub is to code, we are to data. It's now the largest data community around. A lot of government partners, a lot of media partners are on it. We had a really crazy occurrence last week where there's, you may have heard about the presidential elections, and there was some Russian propaganda leading up to that, and the Washington Post and the New York Times wrote articles last week about that propaganda, and they sourced a data set from some community member that had uploaded on Data.World. And so we were in both publications as the source, and then Facebook, and the data had come from Facebook, and Facebook then took the data down where nobody could download it anymore, and then the Washington Post wrote an article about that as well. So the only place you can now get that data is on Data.World, which is kind of crazy as an open data set. So you never know when the tipping points are going to be with the business, but last week was a really big tipping point for us, and a couple of weeks before that we got named in the top 10% of all B corporations in the world, which is awesome. Outside of entrepreneurship, that's the main thing I do. I spend 60 to 70 hours on Data.World. I've got a wife of 21 years, 2 great kids. Our daughter's about to have her bat mitzvah. She's 13. Our son's 8. And I do a lot of startup investing. I'm an investor in 53 startups and 12 VC funds. And but again, the main thing I do is, I'm like you guys. I'm in the arena fighting the fight, and with all the fear and intimidation and everything else that comes with. I'm talking about me being intimidated and fearful. And just all the challenge that means, but it's going really well with my new business.
I thought one of the, I know this session is nominally about culture and scaling, and so we'll go there in quite a few different ways. But the thing I remember really wanting to get Brett's advice on was so Salsify's in the product experience space. How do we help brand manufacturers deliver product experiences to that the consumers are demanding, right? How do we help a J&J drive an experience on their Amazon product detail page and on their social media feeds? And there's a bit of a network play, right? How do you help the brands and the retailers collaborate? And Bizarre Voice, I thought, did that better than anybody had ever done. So it was a real opportunity to be able to get Brett and the Bizarre Voice experience, even though it wasn't Boston-based, into Salsify. So it's been a nice advisor.
It was Austin-based, though. And whenever I say I'm from Austin, people are like, "Are you from Boston?" Yeah. So most people think,
So let's talk about culture. So how many people read the HubSpot culture deck and the Netflix culture deck? Have you guys all read each of those? So like the Netflix one is like the super libertarian, ideal. Like I was impressed with it. The HubSpot one I thought held up. So when we started, Salsify culture was a big thing, and we struggled with trying to figure out how do you write culture down. What did you guys do at Bazaar Voice to try to capture culture?
Yeah, so we didn't write any core values or anything for the first year of the business because the first year was just about survival, and we felt like it would have been inauthentic to write down values without saying, all right, first of all, let's prove as a team that we can work together and become a successful business. Then we'll talk about how we did it, and together we'll write our values. And so we did after a year, after we'd proven, and the first year was just incredible. And so we had a lot to reflect on, like what were the best things that, how did we operate when we were at our best in that first year? And we engaged the whole company in it and came up with 5 values. And then over time, as I was mentioning to you, in our discussion earlier, we reinforced those values through several mechanisms. So as we grew, the team would rate us in management, and myself included, everybody in management, anybody with a manager title and above, would get rated by the team on whether or not we were living the values, and they would do it in a Bazaar Voice type of way, if you know what Bazaar Voice did. So they would do 1 to star on each value, and then describe why. And it allowed me to stack rank the entire management team, and without a doubt, the managers or the executives in my case who reported to me were always the ones always at the top. I was not surprised by. They were the ones where you could just tell they were incredible. And the ones that were at the bottom were always ones that I was also not surprised by. And it gave me a ton of feedback from the team on how to coach them. And sometimes that worked, and sometimes it didn't. There was a real kind of 911 situation one time when I was at Disney World with my wife and daughter. We didn't have our son at that time. And our CFO at the time, I got the ratings back, and our CFO had no ratings. I thought, wow, that is really weird. And then I just felt sick in my stomach. I wanted to puke, because I knew that had to be really, really bad. And so after coming back from vacation, fortunately vacation, was ending that day, I came back and I got each of his team members one-on-one, and I said, hey, I need to ask you, just look me in the eyes, why didn't you fill it out? Like, what's going on? You know how much I care about our culture, and like, why didn't you tell me? Literally every single one of them broke down crying. And I was like, what's going on, And they're like, well, Bazaar Voice is rated the #1 place to work in Austin. This is the worst company I've worked for. Like, this department is awful, And what I found out through that is that he had managed incredibly well with his peers. He had managed incredibly well with me. He had managed very well with the board. And he was just a complete asshole when it came to his team members. And I fired him the next day. And I explained, why. And he looked at me and he said, you're going to be, I'm not going to swear, but you're going to be a blank hero. And he was right, because, one of the most important jobs as a CEO is to say these values actually stand for something. They're not just bullshit. It's not just some thing we fabricated and so you put on a wall. It's, it's real, and we care about it. If I didn't have that process, he probably would have survived in the organization for another year or two. And by the way, he's actually a friend of mine today, because after that he went into counseling and got better, and he credits that as a real turning point for him as a person. So as our CEO used to say, she's now a very successful CEO in Austin of a company named WP Engine. She always would say, General Patton on the decision, Mother Teresa on the exit. And I was always, I really care about people, and I really cared about him. Like I knew that he had the ability in his heart to be a better person. So
So there's a question from the audience.
Yeah, sure, please.
If you could clarify, so for those kind of 360, was it transparent? I mean, because I know that there have been times when someone says, oh, can you comment on your boss? And if there's not enough people in the department or it's not anonymous, then it'd be like, oh, they're great. So
Right.
was that there?
So I made
Experience doing either way?
As we kind of prep for this, we're talking about like getting into some, things that didn't go great culturally. And I guess I just started with one that went well from the standpoint of having that in process. But, obviously I don't want to start out with a story of just, something that negative. But I can tell you that I made a huge mistake with this process at the, not the beginning, but in like year 1.5 or 2, where I made the whole thing anonymous. And that led to a lot of psychological damage for people, like where people are like, man, I really want to talk with that person, whoever it is. I really want to talk with them. But I wanted to be totally authentic, right? And then I made it optional for people to be named. But I introduced a book called Fierce Conversations, which is an incredible book. If you haven't read it, it's by Susan Scott. And it's all about how to have fierce conversations, not yelling at each other, just fierce as in very authentic, very open, very intense. And it's all about how life changes one fierce conversation at a time, like the time you decide to get married or the time you decide to have children. You think back, or the time you decide to take that big job or whatever it is. Those were really, really intense conversations that you probably had in those moments. And so I introduced that book, and we all went through that book, and it became required reading. And I would say, how we practice fierce conversations here. So please name yourself if you feel comfortable. And then 90% of people decided to name themselves. But I still have that outlet for the 10% that were maybe suffering in silence or had a situation where if they were honest, they felt like they were going to be berated or something.
So we have this.
We
struggled with the values. We did write them down fairly early on, and I remember when we started the company, all I cared about, and I had 2 co-founders. All we cared about was we wanted to start a company that there was sort of like a core principle. We wanted to push as much decision making down as far as we possibly could, and therefore we're going to have to be as transparent as we possibly could. That was like sort of the only thing that was really in our head. So there was this empowerment value, and then there was like this anti-value that we just despised, which was like entitlement. So we said, okay, that's what we care about as a company. And I wish that we had just stuck with that and that only in terms of values. We ended up writing a few more values down, and they ended up never feeling as core and as authentic. I felt like we had to have 5 values or we had to have 8 values because everybody had. And I wish that we had said, we don't have to. We can do it with this, because I know every time I would talk about the values, it didn't feel as authentic when I was talking about like focus, not unbalanced. I'm like, I don't really care, and I think that people felt it. And so we had that for a couple years. We ended up retrenching and saying,
Good, you dropped it.
Yeah,
that's what I was going to say.
The laminated cards are still floating around, but the empowerment sort of is now the big thing. And we use this. We use something called Tiny Pulse. I don't know how many of you use it. So it's a tool that basically collects employee feedback, and it's brutal. So you pose a question. We generally pose questions each. I don't know. We do it every 3 or 6 weeks. That's sort of aimed at either a problem that we as an exec team think we're having, or that we think is aligned with a cultural value, and we go get feedback, and then people give unsolicited suggestions. And we just have a policy that unless it's like a personal attack on it's all anonymous. You can't, if it's a small department, it won't attribute it to the department, so you don't run into situations where the one G&A person, is giving, it can have the attribution traced back to them. But we take all the feedback and we publish the survey to the employees, and we just send it out unallocated. So probably the entire time we've done it, I've taken out maybe 2 comments that were just personal. Attacks.
I think the all anonymous thing though is a mistake. Like I definitely learned that because I mean we're all adults, and having that level of dialogue where it's like I'm going to give you real feedback is very appreciated. So I think maybe that company just kind of set that up the wrong way to have it be all anonymous. I certainly learned that.
Yeah, I'd say the way they've set it up for us is most of the employees do opt into giving their name.
Oh, good.
So
Okay. Perfect. Yep.
it's not sort of only anonymous. It works out, but you spot problems. Like we've had a lot of problems at one point we had a problem in the engineering team around culture, and they felt they were working too hard, and then there was in sales it's been no end of scale problems. One day it's the BDRs are a hot mess, and then the next day it's the sales reps aren't hitting
Right.
quota, and that's been really helpful in collecting a lot of that stuff
That's cool.
early. So it's been good.
How have you integrated some of these things into your recruiting processes? I find like when we talk about culture,
Yeah.
we talk about what's existing as opposed to bringing people in and being able to somehow test for that.
Sure.
I'm curious to hear that.
Yeah, so actually that touches on, if I could say what was the most important thing we did in the entire history of Bizarre Voice, and now Data.World we do the same, that shaped our culture, it was how we hired. And so Brant and I started the company. Brant worked for me at Core Metrics, the company I started prior, and he was phenomenal. And the way Bizarre Voice kind of came into being is he approached me at Core Metrics and he said, hey, I'm going to leave in probably 6 months to start my own business. Would you be willing to brainstorm with me and be maybe on my board? And I went through kind of an emotional, internally, just like, oh shit, this is one of my best managers. But then I was like, I'm a total hypocrite. I'm an entrepreneur at the end of the day. So if I don't engage in this way, like, who am I? And so I was like, sure, I'd be happy to. And we started brainstorming. We came up with Bizarre Voice. And at the beginning of, and obviously I decided to leave Core Metrics and go with them and start it. And at the beginning of Bizarre Voice, like the first thing we talked about, and this started a long series of conversations we'd have about culture, is we got really spun up about the idea, and we had done 6 months of research on it, and just like reading everything you could about word of mouth, and really social media wasn't much of a thing then. In 2005, when we started Bizarre Voice, Amazon was 4% of U.S. online retail sales. Facebook was close to the public. Twitter didn't exist. There was no Snapchat. There was no iPhone, et cetera. So there were a lot of things that had to come along to make social media more of a thing. And there were only 3 retailers in the whole U.S. who had customer reviews when we started Bizarre Voice in 2005, believe it or not. So we were super, super passionate, and we're like, how do we make sure that people are as passionate as we are? And we started to talk about it, and I said, well, hey, I've got this kind of secret at Core, something I would do at Core Metrics. Like, I was really good at sales, and so anytime, we were in a pretty tense selling situation, I would typically go in, and we were battling against Omniture, and if I was in the deal, almost every time we'd win. Because I knew our case studies cold, I knew our competitive positioning cold, I had architected the original solution, so I knew how to go as deep as they wanted technically, et cetera. And so as almost in every one of those situations with a new salesperson, I would just write down, like after seeing them present, whether or not I thought they were going to make it. And as a founder of the company, I was really do everything I could to make sure that they would. It's not like I was wanting them to fail or anything. I would just write down what I thought the odds were, and almost every single time I was right if they weren't going to make it. And so I was like, it'd be nice to have that process earlier, and to kind of see before we hire someone. And then I told them a story about growing up and how I thought I wanted to play the electric guitar because I loved Pink Floyd, and I hear David Gilmour playing, and I just thought he can just make the guitar sing. And so I picked it up and I hated it. And I think business is a lot like that. Especially a heady time like this, a lot of people leave big companies and join startups. And by the way, in my experience, 90% of the time that doesn't work out. If you're their first stop as a startup and they're coming for a big company, it almost never works out because they're used to picking up the phone and saying, hi, this is so-and-so from P&G. And then that first time it's like, hi, this is so-and-so from Bazaar Voice. And they're like, I'm sorry, did you say Bazaar Boys? Like, what do you guys do? And it's hard. It's really hard. So they haven't had that, they're standing on top of the Roman Empire. They haven't had that feeling of being a serf. And they, a lot of the sales and everything else they've been able to do is because that big brand name. Not because they're willing this thing into being from the beginning. And so we were talking about that, and I was like, I think business is a lot like romance. Like a lot of times, people just don't know. So we came up with a test for our first candidate that we hired at Bazaar Voice to say, well, let's put them in the role. And our first hire was our CTO. And we got super lucky on who it was. It was the single best engineering manager that had ever worked at Trilogy. Like Joe Lamont would tell you, this is the single best guy. He went on, after Bazaar Voice, to become the CTO of, well, he first became the head of Google Austin, then the CTO of Retail Me Not, which had a huge exit. And now he's CTO of Namely. And so we interviewed Paul, and we're like, wow, this guy's amazing. We did all the behavioral interviewing things that we had learned at Core Metrics, and we basically said, well, let's give him the test. We're like, all right, well, what do we test him on? We got to make this thing up. And our test to him was, a week from now, we'd like you to come in and present to us on how you'd architect the entire solution. Now, and then how you'd evolve that over the next 3 years. Well, he spent like 30 hours on that, and he came in a week later, and he totally blew us away. I mean, our jaw, dropping type presentation. And then we did that with every role from that point on. With sales, we'd call them up on a Friday. We'd be like, hey, congratulations. Everybody here wants to hire you. You've passed through 6 interviews. Everybody is so excited about you. It's really hard to get to this point. By the way, we need you to do one more thing, because we're not like any company that would just give you an offer letter now and start checking references. We have a different type of process. We'd like you to come in on Monday, present to us like we're a prospect. You'll have 45 minutes to present. We'll do Q&A for 15 minutes. We have to stay enrolled the entire time. Tell us which prospect to role play. And, we suggest you take this seriously. After we had data on that, we'd say, oh, by the way, 50% of people don't pass this part of the process, so we really suggest you take it seriously, because that were the stats. And, we would go in, Brant and I, like making guesses on how they would do. And we were wrong 50% of the time. And one thing I didn't tell you about Core Metrics is that we were wrong 50% of the time. Like, we would have someone be on board for 6 months, and 50% of the time it won't work out. Well, culturally, that's very destructive. It's very bad from an opportunity cost perspective. And so, just to compare that to Bazaar Voice, we're wrong only 20% of the time. And that had a huge lift in terms of our culture, in terms of our sales. But the test itself became this badge of honor where people, would look around. They'd be like, well, everybody that I work with went through this hell to get here. And that's not that different from going to a top MBA school. Like if you're here in Boston, you go to MIT or Harvard for your MBA. Those are really hard schools to get into. And when you look around at your peers, you're like, damn, we all did it. So that in and of itself is a bonding experience. But boy, what we were primarily testing, there was one core value that we were primarily testing with this process, and that was passion. It was one of our core values. And these people were freaking passionate.
This sounds great. And actually, I'm also a professor at KU, so I do this to people that join my team. And
Excellent.
I do that because I'm a professor and
I love it.
want to join my team and so on.
Yeah.
But what happens if you're like a very, very early stage startup and you're coming in and you're like,
Yeah.
I would like you to now spend 40 hours of your time doing something for me that I'm not going to pay you for, and then I may not hire you.
Yeah, I used to get these all the time where literally at the beginning of Bazaar Voice, when, it wasn't really anything, people would kind of throw darts at me. Like CEOs would just be like, oh, I could never do that. Like 50% of people would drop out of the process. Like nobody would do that for me. Like it's a competitive market, et cetera. Well, my stats, even when we're small, is around 95% of people would go for it. So I can just tell you from the data that people went for it, and it might have been the fact that we had done a good job whittling people out in the interview process, and we're really looking as much as we could for someone who's very driven and passionate and really understood our calls, and
I think it's actually harder for a later stage startup to stick to that. I mean, I'll tell you, the Boston market at least is so competitive that if it's very easy for a hiring manager, for recruiting, or for any of us to rationalize why you shouldn't do that. And but we've stuck to it. Not
do you do this?
We do this.
Test,
we do it in engineering and we do it in sales.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I don't think the sales one is as predictive or as good yet as it could be. I think the engineering one is very good, and it does. Yeah. Most people, if you're doing it late in the process, right, then you've done a lot of selling to that candidate through that point. So.